This conference will now be recorded.
Computer's talking at me. Sorry about that. So we're now recording, which means we're going to start our class. My name is Heather Adkins. I'm the manager of the Special Collections Department of the Downtown Huntsville Library. I love research. I love writing. I love history. And I've loved history and writing since high school, which is why I ended up majoring in history in both college and grad school. So if you're thinking about taking a history route with college or your career, feel free to email me. I'll have my email up at the end of the presentation here, and I'm happy to talk to you about what a career in history actually looks like. So today's class is fantastic resources and where to find them. Sometimes it's a little hard to figure out what sources are, where to look, and we're just going to kind of go through those a bit today. Okay, so fantastic resources and where to find them. So today we're going to talk about primary and secondary sources. If you took Miss Shalice's class last week, you touched upon different kinds of data. So today we're going to look a little closer at what kinds of sources make up that data. And if you missed her class, don't worry about it. We will cover briefly what she said about it. And then we'll talk about some other things too. We'll also talk about where to look. I think it's really easy to say, I'm going to use this kind of source. But sometimes it is harder to figure out where that source can be found, and we'll talk a little bit about where you can find them. We'll also talk about evaluating sources. Figuring out how to evaluate a source is one of the most important things to learn when it comes to research. So we'll talk about different things to consider that will help you. And finally, we'll talk about taking notes. Believe it or not, there is much more to the research process than simply finding resources and writing a paper. So we'll go over one way that I like to keep track of research. We'll talk about taking notes. So starting with primary and secondary sources. Depending on the type of paper you are writing, it takes a combination of primary and secondary sources to inform your research. And you'll know what kind of resources you need based on what your teacher says in their instructions. Sometimes they'll say all primary sources. Sometimes they'll say all secondary. Sometimes they'll say find 5 books. Sometimes they'll say check a map. These are all different types of sources, and you'll need to know what your teacher says in order to complete your paper in the way you need to. So primary sources, these are original records, meaning they are records that are written or made at the time of an event or shortly thereafter. So we're talking about things like taking a picture or writing in a diary, writing a letter, putting up a Facebook post, anything that is written at the time. On the flip side of that, you have secondary records, which is based on original records. So they are written or made a long time after an event. So you can think of it this way. Primary sources is eyewitness, people who were there, people who were experiencing something, versus secondary sources is analysis. It's someone after the fact coming and saying, okay, what did this person say about this? And then writing something based on that. So now that we know the difference between the sources, basically eyewitness versus later analysis, if you took class last week, you discussed qualitative and quantitative data. So by way of quick review, qualitative and quantitative are 2 broad data sets that make up primary sources. Qualitative is collected through observation. They're narratives. They are what people say and what people write. So let's use yes, Nathan, original sources are better in those cases. I agree. So qualitative, now that we know that it's what people say and write, can y'all give me some examples of what some qualitative sources are? And you can use the chat feature over in the meeting panel. And if not, we will definitely go through examples. Animal behavior, interesting, yeah. A book can be, yes, a book can absolutely be qualitative data. Nature. Sometimes it depends on what you're observing about nature, but usually observations about nature can be, yes. A report or an anecdote, absolutely. Awesome. Okay, so those are some really great examples. We'll go through some more in a couple minutes here. So that's qualitative data. The flip side of that is quantitative. This is something that can be counted or compared numerically. It's typically answering the questions what and how many. So if you think about a source that involves some sort of counting or comparison, what type of source do you think those could be? And you can just write those over in the chat again. Population, absolutely. Algebra, yeah, yes, I can do algebra too. My sister is a high school math teacher, and she teaches history of mathematics sometimes, and whew, math homework, voting, all good answers. Economy, COVID-19 cases, oh, very, very contemporary, yes. Excellent. Okay, these are all great suggestions. We're going to look a little more broadly at some suggestions as well. So, examples. Primary sources. This can be a combination of qualitative and quantitative. So we already said what people say and write. This can include speeches, interviews, conversations, and they can be captured in any sort of ways. That means like videos or audio recordings or even transcribed onto text. That also includes what people write. So autobiographies, memoirs, personal journals and diaries, letters, emails, blogs, Twitter feeds, and really any other form of social media. So if you made a post on Facebook this morning, that could be considered a primary record, a primary source. We already mentioned a little bit images and videos, maps. Government documents is a big one. So government documents and other legal documents like laws, court cases, decisions, big treaties. Newspapers, that one is a little more complicated, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Statistics and data and polls and public opinions are all kind of in that quantitative category. So in comparison, we have secondary sources. So that means things that are using everything that's in our primary list to write what's everything in our secondary list. That includes journal articles, magazines, reports, encyclopedias, and dictionaries. Documentaries, so using like images and videos and oral histories from the primary list and using it for a documentary as a secondary source. And I have newspapers listed again. Like I said, newspapers can be a little complicated, and we'll discuss that. Mainly, it's complicated because it's all relative. It depends on how you're using a source of whether it's primary or secondary. And you can usually do a Google search of some variety or ask a librarian at your local public library to say, hey, is this a primary or secondary source? I'm having a little trouble deciding which. And the problem is it can go either way depending on what the source is. Because sometimes secondary sources can be primary sources depending on the research topic. And we'll talk about 3 different instances. The first is intellectual topics. This is probably a little more abstract than what you'll be researching, but think of it as like the history of history, or studying how historians, or scientists, or scholars have written history. An example of this is if you're researching a scholar or a scientist or anybody that produces published work, then their published work, like books and articles, become a primary source for the purpose of your paper because it shows what that scholar or scientist thought. Further, so let's say you're writing a paper about Madame Curie, and she produced a whole bunch of writings, scientific findings, things she disputed with other scientists, stuff like that. For her, it would be considered a secondary source because she's basing it on information she has collected and found. For us, if you're doing a paper on Madame Curie, the things she wrote would be considered a primary source, even if it's a book or article, because it's things she wrote and you're using to qualify her work. Another example of this is historical topics. So if you're researching a broad time period or a topic, things that were produced during that broad time period can be used as a primary source. My example for this is magazine articles. Typically, magazine articles are secondary sources, but if you're researching something like fashion in the 1920s, like our picture here of our magazine cover, magazines from that time period, things that came out in the 1920s that were fashion magazines, can be considered primary sources because they came from that time period and were produced for that time period. And finally, newspapers. Newspapers can be a little tricky. They can be primary or secondary, obviously, and depending on what the article is and really how you use it. Most articles, most newspapers are secondary. However, reporters, the people writing the newspaper, can be considered basically witnesses to an event. And that being the case, any topic on media coverage of an event or a phenomenon would be treated as a primary source. For example, let's say that we have a newspaper article that came out right after the sinking of the Titanic that's talking about, oh, this great tragedy, the Titanic sank. That would be a primary source article because it came out at the time. However, if you have another article talking about the 100th anniversary of the Titanic sinking, then that is a secondary article. You can use both of those articles in one paper as long as you delineate that one is primary and one is secondary. So those are primary and secondary sources. Like I said, they can be complicated. If you have questions, you can email me, you can talk to your local library, you can Google. There are plenty of websites out there that are built to help you understand the differences between primary and secondary and how to cite them and how to use them. But if you're going to go in search of primary and secondary sources, you probably need to make a list. I love lists. I make lists for everything. So I made a list for you. Here's some things you'll want to keep in mind as you start the process of finding sources. Number one, your teacher's instructions. I said before that typically when your teacher assigns you a paper or assigns you research of some variety, they're going to indicate how much of what kind of sources you need. Sometimes it's vague, depending on what grade you're in, it can be vague. It can just say well-sourced. But usually the lower the grade, the more often it is that you'll have an indication like find 5 books to use as sources, or find 5 secondary sources and 3 primary sources. You'll just need to make sure you double check your instructions to see what it is you're supposed to find and use. Yes, teacher's instructions can also include a number of words. And yes, of course, you can get a notebook if you need a notebook to write things down. And we'll talk about ways to take notes here in a little bit. Last week, Ms. Shalise spoke about research questions, essentially deciding what you want to research and what you want to find out. So keeping your research questions in mind as you find sources is important so that you don't go off on a bit of a rabbit trail, which can happen in research quite a bit. You'll want to take note of places you want to search. Sometimes it helps to jot down some places you want to look for resources. So you don't have to spend time throughout the research process trying to figure it out and going back and forth a whole lot. Note-taking apparatus. I say apparatus because there is so many things you can take a notes on these days. It's basically find something to write or type what you do or do not find when you're looking for sources. And we'll discuss how to do this a little more in a bit. Time. Please make sure you give yourself time to do research because you will not always find what you're looking for the first place you look or the first time you look. So you don't want to be starting your research the night before your paper is due, only to realize you need to go to the library at 10 o'clock at night. So you'll want to make sure you give yourself time. And finally, I listed teacher's instructions again. It is incredibly important you just continually refer back to it and because it'll save yourself from realizing at the last second that you need more sources or you need a different kind of source. So, searching for sources. Yeah, you can also use a phone. That's good too. Whatever helps you keep you organized. So let me ask y'all something. When you want to look something up, what are some of the places you look? And you can just use the chat to tell me. Google, yep. Ooh, lots of Googles. The internet, yep. DuckDuckGo, not familiar with that one. Awesome. Firefox, good. So lots of internet. It's easy to just jump on your phone or jump on the computer. Encyclopedia and books, also good. Sci-fi, Safari. All great suggestions. And we're going to go through quite a, basically, we're going to talk about using sources online and finding them online. And we're going to talk about looking at the library as well. So let's start with what's on your computer. On the internet, you're going to find a number of resources like Google, databases, archives, encyclopedias, and Wikipedia. I'm going to touch on all of these just a little bit. So I think what generally happens when you start searching for something, even if it's the smallest question like how many ounces is a cup of milk, or what year did the Titanic sink? Stuff like that. The first thing you do is type it into your phone, or you go to the computer and type it into Google. Either way, it's an internet search of some variety. So some things you'll find on Google that could help you as resources, both primary and secondary. You'll find websites through the internet, and you'll find books and articles. With regard to books and articles, Google Books tends to have a lot of books that have left copyright and can be considered primary source depending on what you're looking for. It also has previews to more recent books, which you can also find at the library. So if you do a Google search for a book and you can't find it specifically online, more than likely you can actually come to the library and find it here. Websites can also definitely be used as sources, but you'll want to make sure it is a credible website, and we'll discuss more about that in a little bit. But both of these are things you can use. Databases and archives. These are more specific data and informational kind of things you'll find on Google or the internet. Not all of these things will be online. Like for an archive, they'll only have limited what you can find. And sometimes you'll have to email or call them to find out more information. Databases, things like JSTOR, which is a database for journal articles. A lot of libraries will have subscriptions to this that you can come in and use it for free as well. It's a very handy little database. And finally, encyclopedias and Wikipedia. So I've labeled these as jump off points. And I did this because I think these are sources that you can look at to find general information about a topic, but not necessarily something you should cite in your paper. And we're going to discuss that a little more in a little more detail right now. Okay, so using online sources. Usually if you type a topic into Google, one of the very first websites that pops up is Wikipedia. That being the case, you might think that it would be a great resource. But one thing you have to consider, or at least keep in mind about Wikipedia, is that anyone, and I do mean anyone, can write or edit articles whether or not they have expertise on that topic. So that really means internet trolls can come in and do some really casual rewriting of history. Exactly, people can change stuff on Wikipedia. That's right, Raylan. So the problem with that is if someone goes in and writes some misinformation and then you take that misinformation and put it in your paper, that means your paper can be incorrect. But I will show you one way that Wikipedia is actually a really decent starting point. So let's open Wikipedia. I'm going to use this NASA article as an example here. You can do this with any Wikipedia article you find, but NASA has a bunch of information that I think will be helpful for explaining this. So the best way you can tell if an article has accurate information is to go to the very bottom of the Wikipedia article and look at the notes and references section. So the notes and references section is available in hyperlink down at the bottom of the table of contents here. You can click one of them and it will jump all the way to the bottom for you. Sometimes these are long, sometimes these are short. In this case, the notes section is pretty short, but the reference section goes for days. Yeah, goes for days. So these are the sections where you will find all the information the Wikipedia article was based on, and it is these resources that you will actually want to read and possibly put in your paper rather than what's actually in the Wikipedia article. Usually the references will have links to sources online, which makes the search much easier. See all these blue hyperlinks you could click on? The follow-up to that is these are all connected to different statements and data points in the article itself. So down here you see, okay, they talked about the US Centennial Flight Commission. That was one of the sources they used. But you would actually have to go up and find number 1 in order to figure out what they said from that source. So let's scroll up a little bit and let's see. Okay, so in 1977, the latter two were combined to form the NASA Advisory Council. And it has this number out to the side, 170. If you click 170, if you hover over it, the source appears. So you can go to the source from there. Or if you click on it, it'll jump back down to the resources section. But I think I'm just going to hover over it here and we'll click the link. And they got that information from the NASA website on their advisory council. So you know it's a good resource that way. Anyway, I won't focus too much more on Wikipedia simply because that's one of those trial and error things. So we'll go back to our slideshow here. So that's how you can use Wikipedia to your advantage. Like I said, you may not want to quote directly from Wikipedia. You may not even want to put it as a source citation, but you can definitely look at the references and notes at the bottom of those Wikipedia articles to find real sources. So where else can we find sources that isn't online? Do y'all have any ideas? A book, the library, awesome. Yeah, that's what we're going to talk about. let's talk about the library. Dictionary.com, yep. So using the library, most libraries, including the Huntsville-Madison County Library, has a searchable catalog on their website, meaning you can type in a topic and it will pull up all of the books we have on that subject. The library also has subscriptions to online databases, like I mentioned JSTOR earlier, but more importantly, you're going to have access to all of the history books that have previously talked about the topic you are researching. Yeah, Eden, I see your response. You could also ask people, definitely. That's how a lot of research is done too. You start with talking and then you work backwards. So for the library, I'm specifically going to look at books and journal articles and how you can use those. We're going to use Hidden Figures, which was about the female mathematicians who helped get the US into space back in the day. We're going to use this book as our example. You can use books and journal articles in two ways. The first way is at face value. You can read a book and use that book as a source and cite it in your paper and just be done with it. Or you can actually find the book, use the book to find more sources. Because if you take any history book that's well written and well researched and go to the very back of the book, you're going to find a bibliography or a references source page or a notes page of some variety. And this is the starting page of the bibliography out of Hidden Figures. You'll notice that she has archival sources listed. A lot of bibliographies will take the time to break down primary versus secondary sources. So a lot of times it will say primary sources and list everything in alphabetical order. And then it'll say secondary sources and list everything in alphabetical order. Margot Shetterly, who wrote Hidden Figures, actually went the extra mile and broke her primary sources down further. So you'll find things like archival sources, oral history interviews, transcripts she wrote, people she spoke to, videos she watched, books she read from the time period. And then she'll go on later to say, these are the books I also referenced when I was writing my book, and there are a bunch of secondary sources as well. So if you're kind of having trouble finding something online, or you just prefer to look in books first, which is fine, you can actually go to a book you're reading, look at the back, and see what that author cited in order to help inform your paper a little more as well. Okay, evaluating sources. We're going to spend a little more time on this than some of the other things we've talked about because it's important to determine what an author is trying to tell you and how credible the author and their sources are. Because it can greatly affect how you interpret the information that goes into your research paper. So high quality information from a source means high quality information in your paper. So this is maybe a question that y'all may not have answers yet, and we'll go through these definitely, but do you have anything you think about as you go through sources? Like if you pick up a book or look at a website, is there anything you look at that makes you think, this does not seem like a very credible source, or this person looks like they know what they're talking about? So if you have any ideas about what you would look like, go ahead and drop them in the chat. Topic? Date published. Ooh, that's a good one. when you see things that are obviously random or their own opinion leading their research. Okay, that's actually a really good answer too. If it's recent or not, what they want you to do with the topic, the author's background, these are great answers. Yeah, we're going to talk about all of this. Where the author lived, also a great answer. Okay, so these things I'm about to talk about are not necessarily going to come in this order, but here are some things you can think about when you're evaluating a source. The first is, what is the purpose of the source? Is it providing information like newspapers or documentaries? Is it trying to persuade you to agree with it? Does it voice a lot of opinions or have a lot of editorials? Does it advocate for something? A good example of this is if you've watched any of the debates for the presidential election coming up. Are they trying to convince you of something? Is it purely for entertainment? Have you been watching a lot of cat videos on YouTube? That would be entertainment. Or is it trying to sell you something? Are there ads on a website you're looking at that kind of coincide with the reading material that makes you think, well, maybe they're trying to get me to buy something, or rather than actually finding out some facts? These are all things you should think about with regard to the purpose. Another thing you can think about is audience. Who is the author talking to? These can be things like, is the audience scholars and researcher with a specialized knowledge? Do they have expertise in the topic already? And is the author writing to people who are already in the know about what they're writing about? This means that the writing could be more complex than you might expect if you're not an expert in the area. It could also be written for the general public, meaning anyone could pick up the source and read it and understand it. Or is the author writing for students? And typically when I say writing for students, I mean you might be looking at a textbook. You probably have textbooks when you're at school for history, for math, but writing for students usually involves writing textbooks. A few of you said look at who the author is and look at where they came from. This is actually pretty important to determine what the purpose of their paper is and how they're influenced to write a paper. So is the author an individual? Is it someone who studied this as a career, or are they just kind of dabbling? Like, did they make their career out of this, or did they just wake up one day and say, yeah, I'm kind of interested in this? Or, are they writing on behalf of an organization, a school, a government? Are they putting out data purely for informational purposes or to convince you of something? So if it's someone from like an organization, so typically if there's a spokesperson for an organization, they're not voicing their opinion, they're voicing the overall message of the company or the organization they're working for. So you'll want to watch out and see if they're speaking on behalf of someone else versus speaking on behalf of themselves. Credibility. This basically means what are the author's qualifications and what is the publisher's information. Author qualifications can often be found in the About the Author section of a book or website. A lot of websites have those these days. Books can be hit or miss depending on what the book is. And usually what you're looking for is what the author's occupation is, their experiences, or their education, whatever is informing them from their lifetime to write what they wrote. You're also asking yourself, do they have expertise on the subject you're looking at? Or are they just kind of choosing to write about it that day? And again, are they affiliated with an organization or a government or school that would affect their research? Like, are they researching for something versus researching for themselves? I mentioned credibility also extends to publishing information. Publisher information can be found usually in a general search online once you locate the publisher information in a book or journal. So The front matter of a book or journal is going to list the publisher, where the publisher is, what year it was published in, and from there you can look up what kind of sources they usually produce. If it's a university press or a commercial press, you'll want to ask yourself, how easy is it to publish and what are their standards? You're going to get a very different product from a university press than you would from something that is self-publishing, because self-publishing has no secondary checks. Something that is going through a university press or a commercial press is going through multiple levels of editing. So it's peer reviewed, essentially. You have people giving you feedback before it actually gets published. For publisher, you'll also want to ask yourself if it's a popular journal or a scholarly journal. Basically, that means how well researched it is and for what audience it is meant. And again, you'll want to ask if it's an organizational website or something like a personal blog or social media. There's varying levels of credibility depending on what you're looking at online. You want to be careful of that as well. It's particularly because a lot of personal blogs can look like formal websites depending on how well done the website is. You will want to look for accuracy. Is the information correct and well researched? Is there a bibliography? Do they have references and citations that support what the author wrote? Can the facts of an author be verified by another source? So I believe it's in newspapers, journalists work by like the rule of two. You find one fact and you find one source and you find a second source to verify that first source. A lot of times you'll see repetitive information in something like books and articles simply because people need to back up where they found their information from and that it is accurate. And if it's original data collection, like you polled the audience and 100 people answered a question, did the author talk about how their data was collected for that survey? And did the author talk about the validity of how they did that data collection? In other words, did the author recognize their own strengths and weaknesses when it came to data collection? And second to last, a few of you mentioned this, and that is time. Is what you're reading timely? What is the timeliness of the source? When was it written? So books and journals are pretty easy. They will have publication dates, so you know exactly when they came out. Websites should have creation and updated timestamps. Those are usually in very tiny print at the very bottom of the web page you're looking at. And something you want to ask yourself about timeliness as well is, did the information presented at the time the source was written reflect the thoughts and opinions of the society it was written in? Meaning, or for example, if you look at a source from the 1960s and it's talking about civil rights, is it going to express viewpoints that are typical of that time period? In comparison to if you look at a source about civil rights that was written now, is that viewpoint going to look differently because society's values are different now versus then? And lastly, objectivity, which means, does the author or the source present a bias or a specific leaning? Sometimes leanings and biases can lend to writing opinions versus facts. So you'll want to make sure that what you're citing is actually a fact versus opinion. And if it is an opinion, state that you recognize that it's opinion because of this author's bias. Does it promote political, religious, or social agendas? That kind of falls under the audience and what they're trying to say evaluation labels again. And once again, if you're on a website, is advertising content clearly labeled, and what is that advertising content that could signify to you whether there is a leaning in that source? Yeah. One of y'all just posted, for example, slavery was accepted during the 1700s, but not now. Exactly. So the timeliness of the source that came out in the 1700s would look incredibly different than a source talking about slavery now. It's a really good example. Okay, so let's talk about our last thing of our class, and that's taking notes. Um, I had mentioned that taking notes is a really important part of doing your research. It's really the final piece to your research puzzle. Because when you're going through source after source after source after source, and then you take a break for lunch, and then you go read more sources, it's important to keep straight what information comes from which source. This will also help you with, if you take notes, it'll help you with citing your sources later on, as well as helping you keep track of what you've actually looked at. So I learned a very old-fashioned way. I learned to take notes on sources on an index card, which is why you see this index card up here on the screen. But you can use a Word document, you can use your phone, you can use OneNote, you can use Google Docs, whatever you work best in for taking notes is what you can use. And depending on how you want to do it, you can do a whole bunch of things. I used to use different color index cards and post-it notes to write sources on to help with different arguments within my paper. So I could put all the pink notes together because it would support this argument. Or I could put all the orange notes together because it would support a different idea, and it would be easy to look at it and see see what category best fits at what time in my paper. You're going to find what's best for you, whether that's index cards, whether that's taking notes in your notebook, anything that you think. Eden says she uses all of them. I do too, depending on the day. Anything that you feel comfortable taking notes on. Going into note taking, it is also helpful to know what kind of citations you're supposed to be writing. This is going back to your teacher's instructions. Usually they will say, use this type of citation, whether it's MLA or APA or Chicago style. It should be listed in your teacher's instructions, or you can ask your teacher what citation method they prefer. Because having the rules for your citation next to you can help guide how you write notes as well. So here are the main things you want to think about when taking notes. You want to think about the title and author, the publishing information, like where it was published, who published it, the date it was published, where you found the source. If I had a nickel for every time I found a book at a library, and then after the fact thought I found it online, but no, maybe I did find out at the library, but no, I thought I was pretty sure online. It's helpful to write down where you found a source in case you need to go back to it a second time. So whether that's the library or a website, anything that will help you find it again, make sure you write it down. The bulk of what you'll want to write here is a quote that you find that you particularly like, or notes from a source. And it's important here as well to write down the page number of where you found it, because again, if you need to go back and look at it a second time, you don't want to be shuffling through chapters and chapters to find one quote. You can go straight to a page number. Eden, I see that you asked about Chicago style. Chicago style is most popular for history writing. It's similar to MLA, however, it has some stylistic differences, and most of that involves punctuation. But you can find different citation styles and builders on Google as well. An example of taking notes, we're going to talk about Hidden Figures again. This is the full title of Hidden Figures as well as the author. For myself, I tend to write the full title once and then use an abbreviated title from there on out, because if you're writing this by hand, to write this entire title for 50 times in a row is it's a lot. So you can just write hidden figures if it suits you. So we got the title and the author. We've got the publishing information. So it was published by William Morrow, an imprint of HarperCollins Publishers. It was published in New York and in 2016. And I found the copy at the Huntsville Public Library. Hidden Pictures actually has previews on Google Books as well, but it only lets you see, I want to say, the first chapter. So if you want to read the full thing, you actually have to go to the library. So I found the copy at the library, and that's what I used. And then I wrote down a quote and the corresponding page numbers. So my quote was, "State law in Virginia custom kept him," and then I wrote in parentheses, the him they were referring to was Melvin Butler and what his job was, because they didn't say it originally in the sentence. Kept him from truly progressive action, but perhaps the promise of a segregated office was just the cover he needed to be to get the Black women in the door, and a Trojan horse of segregation opening the door to integration, which basically means in order to hire these women, he allowed the organization to be segregated in order for him to give them the jobs, with the hopes that eventually desegregation within the company would happen. Anyway, I think that's a great quote. So if I was doing a research paper on NASA and integration, this would be a great quote to use. You can also take notes on websites. It would just mean instead of doing the book title, you're doing the title of the web page. Instead of the publisher, you're writing the URL. And very importantly, you also want to write the date you accessed the site. Because sometimes websites change between the time you wrote something or researched it and the time your paper comes out. So you'll just want to make sure you write down the date in case the information on the site changes. Writing notes for what you find is great, but it's also helpful to note if you didn't find anything in a source. This will save you from looking at the same sources over and over and over. So even if you don't end up using something from a book or from a website, it's kind of just helpful to know, hey, I looked there and I didn't find anything, or I didn't use anything for this reason. That is all I have for you today. If you have any questions or if you would like a copy of my notes, please feel free to email me. And like I said, I love researching and I love history. And if you want to find out more about how to get into, the history and research field, feel free to ask me about that as well. But until next time Shalise will be back and talking more. I don't remember her topic off the top of my head. I should have looked that up. But you can find what the topic is on the library calendar, and you can find what the topic is on our Facebook page, which is HMCPL Special Collections. But thank you so yes, the cartoon figure is supposed to be me. Thank you for asking that. Thank you so much for joining our class. And like I said, if you have any questions or want my notes, feel free to email me. And we'll see y'all next week, Tuesday at 10:30. Yes, Eden, this is in Google Slides, and hopefully we'll get it up on our YouTube channel as well.